Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. I hope you all had a good break and a happy new year to all those of you who I haven't seen yet individually. Can I remind everybody please to turn off their mobile phones and other electrical devices. Right, item 1 on our agenda this morning is the commencement of our inquiry into underemployment in Scotland. And I'm delighted we have with us Professor David Bell, who's no stranger to the committee, from the University of Stirling, who has, according to the Scotsman anyway, is the leading expert on this very important piece of work, and I know has written quite extensively on the subject. So we're very grateful to you, David, for coming along. Before we get into questions, would you like to say something by way of an introduction?
Sure. Well, I've set out some thoughts in the paper that I submitted to the committee last week. And I guess the basic argument is that both Scotland and the UK as a whole have experienced a very substantial drop in the level of output that they've experienced. That's particularly clear from figure 1 in the paper. Since the beginning of 2008, yet compared with past recessions, the level of unemployment is well below where we experienced, for example, in the mid-1980s and even in the early 1990s. So there is a bit of a query as to why unemployment hasn't risen by as much as people or a lot of commentators had expected. And one of the explanations is that, in a sense, the total hours of work are being divided up between more people than has been the case in the past. So we've had a shift from full-time work into part-time work, and we've had a quite considerable increase in the number of people who say they would like to work longer hours. So they're hours constrained. That's the terminology that we would use. So this, I think, I didn't really allude to this all that much in my text, but it's around the flexibility of the labour market, both in Scotland and in the UK, that this kind of change is possible. So on the one hand, it's a good thing that people are not unemployed, but on the other, they may well be experiencing hardship simply because they are working fewer hours than they would like to do. The economy is demand constrained. There isn't sufficient demand for hours of work to keep everyone employed or to allow us to return to the rates of unemployment, the low rates of unemployment that we enjoyed during the middle of the last decade. So a number of things have happened in terms of this underemployment. One of the issues that I think I've particularly picked up on is around the self-employed part-time people who aren't necessarily young, actually, although the underemployed in general may be young. I think there are quite a lot of older people who are perhaps working more than they had, or more years than they had intended to, perhaps because their pension is not as good as they had perhaps hoped, or when they've had an estimate of their pension. And what they've done, since there's no full-time employment available to them, they've gone into self-employment and are working on average relatively few hours per week. But there's now around 80,000 of these part-time self-employed people. There's about 1 million in the UK. And this is quite a new phenomenon and different from most other countries. Most other countries experienced smaller falls in output as a result of the recession than the UK did. But many of them have now got higher rates of unemployment. So that's by way of introduction.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe I could just start off with a couple of questions and then bring other members in. You've presented some statistics in the paper about the levels of underemployment. Clearly, there'll be some people who are underemployed because they want to be, because it suits them to work on a part-time basis. How do we know that people who are underemployed are actively seeking to work longer hours? How do we get that information?
Well, all the information, I think all the information I've presented is from the Labour Force Survey. And what I do is I collect all the individual responses to the Labour Force Survey, and I've got a file that's got about 2 million responses in the period 2000 to 2012. No. And of course they're anonymised, so I don't know who the individuals are. But one of the questions that is asked is, would you like to work more hours? And if so, how many more hours would you like to work? So I completely agree. There are a lot of people who are working part-time through choice. And it makes sense on all kinds of grounds that people might want to exercise that choice. But this question really is the one that highlights those people who are working part-time, probably, and who would prefer to work more hours. So I think we can distinguish the part-timers who are happy to be part-time from those who are part-time but would like to work more hours. And in fact, I haven't gone into the statistics. Some of them say they'd just like to work a couple of hours more. They are actually asked how many hours more they would like to work. Some want to work a lot more hours.
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, you said earlier there was sometimes a positive to underemployment because it was better than the alternative, which was unemployment. And anecdotally, we do hear of companies which, as a result of the economic downturn, have smaller order books, and rather than going through a process of making people redundant, have gone to their workforce and said, would you agree to work shorter hours collectively, rather than have to make redundancies, and that therefore retains the skill base. Is that something you've come across as a phenomenon?
Yes, I mean, I think this happened during this recession more than has happened in the past, and is partly due to greater flexibility on both sides, management and workers, than has been the case in the past. The argument about retaining workers is what's called labour hoarding. So you hang on to your best workers even though your order book has fallen, because you imagine that you expect that in the future your order book will rise again, and you don't want to go through the cost of training and hiring your skilled workers again. That argument works up to a certain point, but at the moment, from what we read about employers' expectations of the future, none of them are terribly bright. So the hoarding argument for skilled workers, I think, is starting to pale a bit. But I think the general flexibility of employers saying, well, let's find a way around this problem, and workers working with them to do that, does probably carry some weight.
Okay, thank you. The last question I want to raise before I bring others in is in relation to the international comparisons, because one of the things that's come out of your paper is that UK levels of underemployment are substantially higher than the EU average. Do you have any understanding of why that is? Why the UK is different?
Yeah. One way that I would put this is that you've got to think about the labour market in two ways. There's the external labour market, where people move in and out of firms, and then there's the internal labour market, which is the labour market within a firm. So what can happen is, as I've already described, is that employers and employees may agree to change the pattern of work and pay, perhaps, within the firm. And I think that's happened quite a lot in the UK. And that has led to a certain level of underemployment. Whereas other countries, and I think, for example, here of Spain, haven't haven't got the flexibility to do that. And they have a huge number of what are called temporary employees. And they had them particularly in the construction industry. So I think more than 1 million people were made unemployed in the Spanish construction industry when the housing boom came to an end. And they had no mechanism really for kind of giving the people working in the construction industry a few hours per week. So they were all laid off. So I think we have made, the UK, Scotland, has made more use of this kind of internal flexibility, which leads to what we call underemployment, and less of the external labour market where people are just laid off and they go on to unemployment. So I don't think, I'm trying to recall, I think that the fall in output in Spain is comparable to the fall in output, or until recently at least, to the fall in output in the UK. They've had a hugely bigger rise in unemployment than the UK and Scotland has had.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to welcome Mary Scanlon, who's joined us this morning. All right, Dennis Robertson.
Good morning, Professor Bell, and thank you very much for the briefing paper. Can I maybe just stay with the flexibility aspect at the moment? Certainly my previous job, I was involved, and certainly when we had young women going off on maternity leave, it was their choice to come back quite often at part-time with reference to childcare. And with reference to that flexibility, it's fairly new, really, in terms of the employment market. Is there any evidence to suggest that once they come back, say, on a part-time basis, maybe 10 hours less than they were working originally, and once they've got their childcare sorted out, and maybe after a couple of years they want to increase their hours, is that perhaps, with regard to the evidence that you have, a significant number of people?
I don't have the statistics on that. All that I would say is that women returners do find it harder to kind of get back to the same trajectory they were on prior to having had children. And I think there probably are quite a large number in this category, but I don't have the statistics on it.
Is that because the employer has made the suitable adjustments with reference to them going off initially and coming back as a requested part-time working hours, and the companies or agencies have adjusted to accommodate that, and then to adjust again could possibly find perhaps very difficult?
Well, yes, that may be true, and a lot depends how long they've been off for, and what arrangements the company made in the meantime to replace the labour that they had previously supplied, and then when they come back, how many part-time hours they're able to provide. So yeah, it is a complex area, and I would only say that I think the evidence shows that it is quite difficult. In many cases, probably the public sector is one where it is less difficult to kind of get back into the same trajectory you were on.
Perhaps then move on to a different area and
Sure.
look at the skills workforce. We hear quite often, maybe from the energy sector and certainly construction, that they're finding it difficult to recruit people into those sectors because of the skills required. Do you believe enough's been done by the colleges and universities to address that? I mean, it would appear now with the Energy Academy that they're starting to look at that, and that will have a significant impact on underemployment later?
For several years now, there's been quite a change in funding in the universities, certainly into what are called the STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering, and maths. So another part of this is also on the employer's side, making these kinds of jobs attractive to graduates, and particularly getting at individuals when they're young, when they make critical choices that affect their path into university, then through university, and then I have tried to promote, for example, mathematics in schools, which is, I think, it has suffered from a very bad press from the last couple of decades at least, but is absolutely essential if we're going to become a vibrant economy and return to the kind of growth that we've experienced in the past. So efforts are being made, whether it's all joined up and whether enough is being done early enough to influence young people, because it's the choices they make prior to going to college or going to university that are very important, it seems to me.
Now it's been sector-led rather than education-led.
Well, I think the sector has a very big role to play. I know that some companies are working quite hard on this, but I think there is a way to go, and science and maths and engineering have not got a very good press. And of course, I had a lot of graduates and undergraduates in the last decade who were, pretty smart people, and what they would aspire to do is to go down to the city.
Wiener, I'm just wondering, in your opinion then, do you think we're doing enough to address the gender inequality? And again, I would think that if that was being done sufficiently, that would have quite a significant impact on the underemployment that we currently see.
I mean, I know, for example, that the Royal Society of Edinburgh has been doing work on women in engineering. One of my colleagues was did some work on that. I'm a little worried that it's a bit bitty and it doesn't quite make the overall impact that's necessary to attract young people, particularly women, in sufficient numbers into these areas, which, as I said, are essential to returning to a more acceptable growth path. Yeah. Well, yeah.
I'm just wondering how can we then join it up as opposed to being bitty then?
Well, I don't know whether one looks for champions to progress these kinds of issues, whether one makes sure from ministerial level that everything is being done that can be done. These are issues for the government, I think, but it is important.
Thank you. Marco Biaggi.
I have two questions that follow on from some of those issues. One of the points that you had made in the submission was that the analysis of the LS data was that the underemployed in the UK were more likely to be male, and yet the EU27 information is that 67.1% across the EU tend to be female. Mm-hmm. And on that gender differential, what is different about the labour market here that has caused that?
I was quite surprised at that finding when I did it last week. It seems that there are a lot of young, particularly unqualified males who are seeking work in Scotland. Why it appears that they outnumber the females in the Scottish case, I am not entirely. I don't have a very good answer to that question. I think that's an interesting one. Whether they have more options around the amount of time that they can devote to work. So if young women have caring responsibilities of whatever kind, then they may say, the males may say that they're available for more hours and would like more hours. But actually, it's funny, coming in on the train, I was looking at that issue and I didn't come up with a very good answer. But that's a possible explanation.
Very refreshing to have a witness saying they don't have an answer to the question.
Very pleasing to be the one that asked the question as well. The other point was with regard to some of the variables that you provide more information on in terms of working in the private sector and being less qualified. I wonder, is there any further information on breakdown by industry or size of employer for patterns of underemployment? Because I didn't see that in the submission or the company paper.
But actually, I didn't want to overload you. That's quite an easy thing to do, and I could come back to you on that point without any difficulty.
Have preliminary comments?
One other aspect of the big change since the 1980s, which I remember reasonably well, is the shift out of manufacturing into services. And manufacturing tends to have more rigid working arrangements simply because of the nature of production. Whereas services, that's not so much the case. So my feeling will be that it may be a lot of people involved in personal services and retailing, that kind of area, where now there's huge flexibility in working hours that is feasible. They might well like to work longer hours, whereas if you're in manufacturing, you have a shift, and there's much less flexibility around that. But another thing that I did find, which is interesting, and which I do refer to, is the reduction in paid overtime working, which partly may be a reflection of the reduction in production in the size of the production industries. Because paid overtime is more typical of these industries, whereas in the service sector, whether you're going to get paid overtime or not is much less clear.
Ruther Grant.
Thank you. Can I just go back over some of the comments you made earlier? Just one of the earlier comments you'd made about other countries having smaller decreases in output but larger increases in unemployment. Just so I can get that clear in my own head, is the decrease in output per head of worker, which would mean that people who are in work are fully employed rather than maybe underemployed like ourselves, or is that kind of an output as a country? Are they doing better in keeping their...
Well, let me give you a kind of example around that. When I'm talking about decline in output, it's decline in output of the country as a whole. So it's overall output. Now, if the number of people in the country are staying the same, then if there's a 5% reduction in output for the country as a whole, then there's a 5% per worker reduction in output. But then think of a country like Ireland, which has had a very substantial reduction in output. Actually, one of the reactions, which hasn't happened in Scotland at all, really, has been an increase in emigration. So lots of young Irish people have left following the recession. Also, a lot of people from Eastern Europe have gone back to their country of origin. That means that although, let's say, output in Ireland fell by 10%, output per worker didn't fall by quite as much as that because a lot of the workers left. So in general, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a decline in output is a decline in output for the country as a whole. It's not per worker as such. If the number of workers stays fairly stable, then it amounts to more or less the same thing.
Okay, so I suppose that leads to another question. So if you take, for example, the other countries that have higher unemployment, more people have gone out of work, but their output hasn't decreased in the same way as ours. Does that mean that productivity per working worker has risen, or how are they bucking that trend?
Yes. So, well, this is a very interesting area, because the implication from what's happened in the UK is that productivity per worker has fallen quite a lot. And there's a big debate, which I refer to on the first page or the second page, as to whether that productivity can ever be recovered whether there's the capacity in the economy to go back to that trend line that I showed in figure 1. Now, the discussion, I think, yes, productivity maybe has fallen less in Spain than it has in the UK, because they now have more unemployment than we do. More people were put onto the jobs market as such. Is this a bad thing or a good thing is kind of difficult to say, because if you've got people who are in work who are maybe they're relatively low productivity just now, but they're only on on half time, they might be without much cost be able to double their output. They already have the skills to do for 40 hours what they're currently doing for 20 hours. And unlike Spain, where you would have to hire them back into jobs and make sure that they had those skills. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, it doesn't look that good for the productivity figures at the moment for Scotland, but I'm not sure whether that's whether we should really be terribly worried about that, because there possibly is the capacity to increase the productivity again relatively easily. I know that was a very long-winded answer to that question.
No, that was really helpful, because I think one of the things I suppose we're told often is that when you're in a recession, you should prepare for the upturn coming out of the recession. And if you have that built-in capacity within your economy, that allows you to capitalise on that. So that totally makes sense. Can I then turn, I suppose, to kind of the issue of part-time working, full-time working, underemployment and gender. I was quite interested in your paper. You were talking that part-time workers are less likely to be associated with labour hoarding and maybe underemployment. Is that because they're more likely to be put out of work, and would that then reflect why unemployment figures for women are increasing kind of faster than in other genders?
The pattern of part-time work is that there are exceptions. There are some very highly paid people who work part-time, but they are the exceptions. By and large, people who work part-time are less skilled, are less well paid, and are more frequently women than men. So I guess, in the recession, and indeed in previous recessions, part-timers are just that kind of step removed from the core workforce. You could say temporary workers are also in that category. And what you tend to find happening in a recession is that employers will try to protect their core workers, and those that are a step removed or temporaries are more likely to find themselves on reduced hours or possibly losing their jobs. Having said that, there has been an overall increase in part-time working in Scotland during the recession, and this may be because employers are looking at their workforces and saying, well, the core workforce is smaller than we used to think it was. We'll franchise out bits of the operation that we didn't do in the past, and these people no longer part of what I think of as my core workforce, and I will take on a part-time or some of these peripheral areas to keep costs down, may take on part-time workers for particular tasks, and of course they keep their overall costs down because the associated pension and national insurance and so on are probably less onerous. if you're talking about part-time work. Of course, on the employee side, that's not good. For the employer, it may be beneficial.
And I suppose the other issue that kind of disagrees with unemployment figures, you say that underproductive are likely to be young men, whereas young men, or certainly young people, tend to make up a lot of the unemployment figures as well. So it kind of says there's two things going on with young people. One, they're not getting jobs in the first place, and two, when they are, they're maybe not being used to their full potential.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the youth unemployment figures, in a sense, understate the problem of young people and the labour market. And one other aspect of that is what I talked about here, which is underemployment of young people. They want to work more than they are currently being able to work. And they say that, you know, when they respond to the labour force survey, they say they would like to work more hours. Older people, it's much more common for them to say they would like to work fewer hours. And there's yet another aspect, which I didn't bring out in this paper, but I did in the paper I prepared for the committee, but I did bring out in a previous paper with David Blanchflower, which is around kind of the occupational ladder. So young people, when the economy is normal, go in at a certain level, which is appropriate for their skills. Now, if the economy is in recession, these jobs become less readily available. And so people go in at lower rungs on the ladder. So you get graduates doing fairly menial jobs. Now, what this means is that the youth unemployment problem may take a very long time to fix, partly because there are a lot of young people who are already in work who are saying they'd like to work more hours. And if the employer gets an upturn in demand, what he's going to do is to hire these workers who are already there for more hours, rather than picking up young unemployed people. And also because some of the young people who are already in work are overqualified for what they're doing, then it makes it doubly difficult for the unqualified to get any experience. A lot of employers are stipulate that experience is one of their key criteria for hiring people. And if you never get into the work environment because of these barriers, then it becomes very, very difficult for the young unemployed. And you then end up with these scarring effects that David Blanchflower and I have talked about, and others have talked about, that if you go in to the labour market, you have a long period of unemployment when you're young, before you go in, that can affect the rest of your career. And in terms of the economy, it affects your productivity for the rest of your career. So it's bad for growth.
I've got two members who want to come in with supplementaries, Chick Brodie and then Marco Biaggi. Chick.
Good morning, Professor Bill. I wonder if I may follow on the international comparisons. I have to say I'm somewhat cynical seeing any survey produced by the Office of National Statistics given their performance of late. But I wonder, do you agree that the differences both in terms of population growth, economic infrastructure of different countries, the demographies, make these comparisons somewhat slightly unfair?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Let me say one thing on the statistics first. The labour force survey, I won't answer for other stuff that the Office of National Statistics produce, is what's called a national statistic, which means that it meets certain criteria in relation to how it's put together. It's also used as the basis and accepted as the basis by Eurostat for the statistics on the labour market that Eurostat produce monthly or quarterly, which are the basis of the international comparisons that you're asking me the question about. Okay, So the labour force survey feeds into the Eurostat survey, and if you go onto the Eurostat website, you'll find all these comparative statistics. You know, youth unemployment in Greece now above 50%.
Consistent methods for assessing that across every country.
Yes, but your question is quite right, because the basis on, so you ask a person whether they're available for work and could start work in the next 2 weeks, and they ask the same question in each person who's being surveyed. Now, what that does leave out is the context, the national context. So, you know, for example, the black economy in Greece is much bigger than is the case here. So maybe the 50% figure has to be taken with some element of doubt. The Northern European countries are pretty, I think, diligent around the collection of statistics. But again, the context matters. And here I'll give you an example from Germany, which has a youth unemployment rate which is pretty much the same as the adult unemployment rate and is well below our unemployment rate. And everyone now wants to have the German system of training young people and bringing them into the labour market. And I'm affiliated to an organisation called the IZA, which is the Institute for the Study of Labour in Bonn. And the director of that study, who is obviously German, talked about this issue not that long ago, and said, well, you know, every country might like to copy Germany, but actually our system is rooted in medieval times. You know, it's to do with the craft, effectively what were the crafts, and the way that apprenticeships are delivered in Germany, and the vocational training. And he argued, you know, it's not just the process, but it's that all of the key stakeholders in German society see it as a key duty of theirs to ensure the smooth transition of young people into the labour market at as high a level as possible. And, you know, we're a long, long way from that. But the point you make is right. I think the statistics are reasonably consistent, but the contexts are always important.
And I think having run 8 companies across Europe, the infrastructures are different. So the context might be right, but the basis of the data collection is very different, I would suggest. Can I another question? Just based on the figures that if we look at, as reported in the Scotsman, that 29% of Scots firms increased their turnover in the 3 months ending November. 32% stayed the same, and 39% experienced a decrease. You make a very valid point regarding overtime working, which I think has become endemic. In fact, one of the biggest challenges I know that I and my fellow managers faced was changing the rationale behind why people had to work so much overtime. What does surprise me is your comment that productivity has fallen in those circumstances. I mean, normally when one reduces overtime, you find that productivity tends to go up. What's the rationale behind, do you believe the productivity levels in Scotland falling?
Well, I think that's, you know, there will always be exceptions to that, and there are some very, very efficient firms in Scotland. But in terms of the overall economy, output has fallen by quite a lot. Employment hasn't fallen by that much. If you just take the total employed, and that seems to imply that productivity per worker must be falling. Now, as I was saying, that doesn't mean that there's not the capacity there to increase it again quite sharply. And in fact, it doesn't also mean that productivity per hour is falling.
That's the point I was trying to get to.
Yeah. The productivity per hour, I think, may have fallen very little, if at all. So it's quite complex.
Per hour, I would suggest, given, I mean, yes, we're in a recession and there is a decline in activity, but I think productivity per hour is a much more rational measure. Just if I may follow on to that in terms of the number of unemployed, have we any statistics to indicate how many people are in more than one part-time job?
Yes, the labour force. I haven't presented the data again. If I make a list, I'll do that. The labour force survey does ask people if they're working a second job. It doesn't ask them if they're working a third and a fourth job. But if they're working a second job, we actually know a lot about it. I haven't touched on this issue at all. It asks questions like, is your second job self-employment? I have a kind of self-employment second job in the sense that I write for the papers occasionally, and I occasionally get paid, not very well, for doing that. But I work from home and I use a computer. All of these things are questions that are asked in the labour force survey. So we do know how many people are working second jobs. And I can provide some statistic. I don't think it's changed hugely, but I wouldn't draw a definite conclusion until I had a clear look at the stats.
One last question. In terms of looking at the third sector, which is growing, the social enterprise and the voluntary sector has grown by 13% since 2008. I mean, is that a fundamental? Is it a rush to do that because of lack of employment in the stable economy? I'm not suggesting social enterprises are not stable; they are. But or do you think it's a fundamental cultural shift that we're seeing in our economy, that people are becoming much more entrepreneurial, or not?
I mean, there has been a steady increase in the number of self-employed people in Scotland. There's no question about that. There's been a steady increase in the last decade, and it's continued into this decade. What has happened, I didn't bring this out in paper, but I'm sure about this, is that the number of self-employed people employing other people has fallen as a share of the self-employed. So there's a lot of kind of people who are, working on their own behalf. They're not entrepreneurs in the sense that they're building up companies and themselves employing people. I'm not saying that that's not happening, but the more typical self-employed person now is working for themselves. Now, of course, that may partly reflect things to do with the tax system. It may reflect the fact that people want to have greater flexibility, greater control over their lives. There's a host of reasons, but that's Scotland was often criticised in the past for having low levels of self-employment. Now, we don't have the levels of self-employment that there are in the southeast of England, but self-employment has been increasing pretty continuously and has continued to do so since the start of the recession.
Thank you. I mean, just on that point, which is very interesting. One of the problems, as you rightly say, is with Scotland's economy is that we've had start-up businesses of the size of the nature of about 35 per 100,000 employees, which is frankly unacceptable. I mean, have you any idea how we might improve that so that the underemployed are either encouraged to start up businesses, or that we can grow the small business sector much more actively?
speaking as a researcher, I feel we ought to know a lot more about it. I don't, it is an area that it is quite difficult to get a good data. For example, this growth in the self-employed part-timers, I'm about to do a kind of fairly big bit of research on, because they're now a quite important group. And you think, well, if they're working part-time and they're self-employed, they're not likely to be the kind of people that are going to hire other people. If they're only working 14 hours a week, how could it be that they're going? So I think we've got to know a bit more about what drives it. Of course, you've got places like the Hunter Centre, which is looking at this issue. You've got Scottish Enterprise. You've got the local authorities now who have a role in all of this. And I think there's been more emphasis in the educational system. Not hugely more, some more emphasis in the educational system, looking at the possibility of being self-employed. But of course, if you're young and you start off self-employed, your probability of lasting a year is less than if you have already got some experience. So I think there has been some improvement, but it's glacial.
Thank you. Marco Biaggi, do you still want to come in?
It was largely answered, but perhaps to add to your list of things to send on to us, the numbers on that productivity for hour worked, because I think it would be interesting to compare that with productivity per worker, which had been what I was going to ask.
Thanks. Okay, Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. I get the impression that, in the newspaper article and so on, it didn't say that, Professor Bell's outraged at this, or, and I get the impression, even after, a bit of discussion this morning, that you're not quite sure if this is good or bad. That on the one hand, it's maybe a fair and reasonable, rational response to the downturn. On the other hand, there may be, some elements of it that are not so good. I mean, I'm not clear. For instance, when you ask people the question, would they like to work more hours? Are they really answering that question? They're not just answering the question, I'd like to have more money, which pretty much all of us are going to answer yes to. And so I can see that, there is, I think, a vast difference between the retired professor who does a bit of freelance consultancy work and, perhaps somebody who's, at the living wage and only getting a few hours a week. And it seems to me as if the data's perhaps not quite capturing an accurate picture, or am I wrong there?
Well, there's one thing I should have said that I haven't said, which is very important, and that is that the question about hours, would you like to work more hours, is finished off by the phrase at the same rate of pay. So it's not, moving on to £1,000 an hour. It's at the same rate of pay. Would you like to work more hours? And if you would, how many of such hours would you like to ask? So people aren't expecting a pay rise. They would get more income, but they would have to give up some of their leisure time to do that. So they're making that judgment. People do that all the time. They choose to work part-time. But this group, I think the patterns in it over time have been so strong that we've got to believe there is some validity in the data, like younger people consistently being the ones that say, we would like to work more hours, like people in the private sector consistently saying we would like to work more hours, and so on. So, I agree with you in a sense with your statement at the start. The underemployment has got some positive aspects as well as some negative aspects. Ideally, we'd like to be in a situation where the economy was not demand constrained. There's not enough demand in the economy. That's the fundamental problem that underlies all of this. But given that we are constrained on demand, what is the best kind of situation to have? I think I would prefer our situation to the Spanish situation, to be quite honest.
And going back then to figure 1, given that you're saying that, you know, the underlying problem is demand constraint, and I don't think many people would disagree with that. I mean, going back to this figure 1 where you show this graph, and what you talk about is a kind of demand gap, if you like. But do you not feel that, you know, and I take it that gap would be, you know, the calculation is between that, you know, trajectory had it continued going upwards and the actuality. But do you not think that ever-increasing trajectory of growth at that kind of level was in any case unsustainable, and that perhaps that's creating a bit of a false impression?
I agree with you on that point, because you look at that graph and you think, oh my goodness, we're way short of where we should be. But the graph is drawn based on the data during the 1990s and the last decade. And the question I think you've then got to ask yourself is, well, where the 1990s and well, in particular, the last decade, based on sustainable economic growth? And I think the answer to that is probably no. They were built on credit, and the risk associated with that credit had not been properly taken account of. And therefore, that line would be somewhat lower. The trend line would be somewhat lower than is shown there. All I've done is project from the data that we had.
What I'm trying to get at, in a sense, though, is there a line perhaps then between points somewhere which would get us back to a more optimal employment situation? Because I was struck by what, you know, you were talking earlier on about, on the one hand we're talking now about underemployment, but not so many years ago people were routinely working overtime, and at what point, you know, you've got to say, if it's a case that people routinely have to work overtime, maybe leading into what Chick's talking about, simply to get by, then that's not, I think, what you would say is an optimal situation. And in a sense, what I'm getting at is that there's a calculation in terms of, you know, you've talked about, you know, a productivity gap, in a sense that there's you know, you could, I dare say, do a fairly simplistic calculation about, you know, number of hours required to bring people to fuller employment, and match that with output. Is it possible to do a calculation and to arrive at a line that seems to be a sustainable line?
The answer to that is that would be a difficult calculation, and I would think of it this way, in the sense that you could draw a line, but then how would you get to that line? You know, what policies would you need to put in place in order to be able to get there? Now, let's think about, I mean, there's the so-called lump of labour fallacy, which is that there are a fixed number of hours available of work available in the economy, and it's just a question of arranging the hours and the people to ensure that everyone's in employment. Well, that fallacy was blown apart by the increase in the number of women working in the Scottish economy during the 90s in particular. You know, if there had been only a limited amount of jobs available, then these people wouldn't have managed to find their way into work. Now, another important statistic or finding is around labour market flexibility. You could think of us on the one hand and think of France on the other. France has had a law, I think, restricting hours of work to 35 per week. Now, that hasn't really done the French economy a whole lot of good, to be honest. And they're looking at ways of trying to roll back on that, because they're finding that it's difficult to attract companies into France now, and they're losing some of their famous actors to Russia because of the rate of tax. And then on the other hand, the OECD does some work where it kind of measures labour market flexibility and compares them across OECD countries. Now, it's based on things like employment protection legislation, redundancy arrangements, and so on. Spain has very high, comes out with a very high score on that measure. Basically, because if you're in work in Spain, you accrue redundancy rights very rapidly, and it becomes very, very expensive for employers to lose you. And that means that they take on lots of temporary workers, and these are the guys who are now out. So there's looking at ways of changing the employment legislation in Spain. The UK is third lowest in terms of employment protection legislation amongst the OECD countries. And you can interpret that as saying the UK labour market is the third most flexible. The only two countries above the UK are Canada and the US. And then you go to countries that are very successful but have high levels of protection, Germany being one of them. So, you know, it would be nice to think of this trend line. I'm not sure, I think it's beyond me to work out exactly what it is, and certainly beyond me to work out what the policies are that would get you to that point sustainably.
Presumably you'd be in elected office if you come up with a solution to that.
In all countries.
Just one final question then. Do you differentiate, or do you see any differentiation in this trend between private and public sector? I mean, you would imagine it much greater in private sector employment, but you hear about, you know, local authorities and so on employing people on 0-hour contracts and so on. Is this a phenomenon that's spreading to the public sector?
I think it is. I think it definitely is. I think there's possibly more of a core, or a group of people who would be deemed the core workforce in the public sector. It might be larger than in the private sector. So, for example, public sector organisations probably do a bit less in terms of franchising out some of their activity. Although they do quite a lot. The university franchises out its catering to the same firm as the Scottish Parliament franchises out its catering, and that is coming in more. But I think it's a much slower process in the public sector than it is and has been in the private sector.
Sorry, just one final question. Is there any sense in which this phenomena, is there any way in which this sense in which this phenomena actually predates the recession of the credit crunch?
There's a lot of this stuff, like the increase in self-employment was ongoing before the recession, well before the recession, and it has blipped up a bit since the recession. But it's not, some of the things were certainly happening anyway, partly due to changes in legislation that have taken place over the last few decades.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I've got three members who want to come in with what I hope will be fairly brief supplementaries. I'm conscious we've been going for now for about an hour, and you've done very well, Professor Bell, but you must be starting to run out of steam. So, Rhoda Grant was first.
Yes. In your paper, you talk about underemployment being better than unemployment, although it's not desirable. And you talked about those who are underemployed experiencing hardship. What is the knock-on impact to the rest of the economy of that?
Well, there will, the Labour Force Survey doesn't tell me this, but you can reasonably speculate that if people are just getting by, then there's higher government expenditure, for example, in terms of tax credits. There's lower tax revenue going to the government. There may be people dropping out because of the cost of childcare if they have so few hours that in fact they end up finding it is more productive, in quotes, for them as a household to look after the children than it is to be in work. That's certainly a possibility. They probably are not making any savings for the future, including for pensions. And clearly they may be just having difficulty in terms of meeting the regular bills that they're confronted by. And they're going to be making decisions at the margin, possibly around, are they better off in work? Are they worse off? Would they be better off on benefits?
And I will be brief, Convener. Is there a growth, do you think, in the number of people working overtime? I mean, albeit maybe just a few hours a week, for no gain, just with the expectation of job retention or job security? And do you believe employers are taking advantage of that?
Well, I mean, young people in particular are desperate to get experience. And they think actually that when they weigh up, some of them I know, when they weigh up the value of the experience, they don't care very much about what it is they might be earning. So you get these internships, for example. That's now quite a common thing. And you anyway had the phenomenon of what's called unpaid overtime. And I've looked at this quite extensively in the past. It often happens, it doesn't happen in manufacturing or in production sector where you know exactly what you've got to do and how long it takes to do it. But in the service sector where contracts are a little more nebulous and how long it might take you to do something can vary for understandable reasons, then you may end up with people saying, well, actually, I work longer than I was contracted to, although there's some doubt about how much you are contracted to, but people do it because they may feel they need it either for advancement or even just to retain their job. So, this happened way before the recession. There's no question about that. There's Goldman Sachs is a company that one hesitates to leave be first to leave the office. That's always the story, whether it's true or not. But of course, they're very well rewarded. People who work for Goldman Sachs. But the issue of unpaid overtime is much more pervasive, and you could argue that it's employers taking advantage of people, but you might also say, well, it's a way of the employees signalling that they're good, that they're the kind of people that you ought to promote.
Chick Brothy, do you want to come in?
Yes, just if I may, Professor Bell, coming back to one of the answers you gave to my colleague Mike McKenzie in terms of temporary labour. Have you been able to make any assessment, or is there any research available in terms of what, notwithstanding the changes in requirements on agencies now as to how they record work, on the impact of temporary labour, both in terms of unpaid employment numbers and productivity?
That's another one that I can come back to you on. There are numbers of the Labour Force Survey has a detailed question on the kind of contract you're on, including temporary contracts. There's 0 hours contracts, there's flexi-time contracts, all kinds of contracts. I haven't looked at those in detail. I hesitate to say that, but my impression was that there hasn't been a huge change over the recession in the number of people on temporary contracts in Scotland. But that I would prefer to wait till I went back and had a look, and I could tell you some stuff about those people on temporary contracts, what industries they're in, what level of pay they get, and so on. So I can add that to the list.
A brief question. My friends in HMRC have asked me to ask you if you can speculate on the size of the black economy.
Well, I would be just speculating, wouldn't I? I've come across it. Yeah, I've come. You know, I think there are edges in certain industries. Construction being one obvious case where there is still.
Experience here, surely.
I couldn't possibly comment. I don't think the black economy is huge. It's not on anywhere like the same scale that it is in, say, Eastern Europe or in the Mediterranean countries. But I worry a little bit that HMRC don't have the resources to actually investigate it properly. Fairly large scale defrauding, say, of VAT goes on. But they don't have the resources to ensure that the taxpayer is adequately protected, the other taxpayers.
Right, Alison Johnson's been extremely patient, so Alison, over to you.
Thank you. I'm probably stepping back a bit to a question Mike Mackenzie asked earlier. Under figure 8, it says, it suggests that people would like to work more hours at existing pay rates, but it doesn't directly address the issue by asking workers if they'd like to work more hours. And I just want to sort of hone in on that and firm up, is it your view that the people who are asking to work more hours, that this is financially driven? This isn't about people who is it about people who simply can't afford to give up their leisure time? They haven't got any leisure time because they can't afford leisure time. Is there a societal expectation that we should all work that we should work full time? Is it about status, or is this purely about the need to be able to, afford to live properly?
Mm-hmm. My feeling is that it's mainly the latter, that it's about the need to live adequate, or to fund their lifestyle. And my argument would be that it has risen so much during the recession, you've got to think it has to be something to do particularly with the recession. In other words, people haven't got the money. Now, if it had been status, well, we wouldn't have expected much difference during the recession as compared with the previous few years. So my reading of the sudden upturn in the number of people saying that they would like to work longer hours is mainly to do with a feeling of hardship, and that they cannot support the lifestyle that they would like to have.
Is there any information that these people are the people who are in low-paid jobs?
Again, that's not a difficult thing to find out. I think, recalling my analysis, I think the answer is yes, but I better check that. I'm pretty sure it is.
Just one more point, if I may, Convener. We've heard a couple of members discuss the impact on women. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned childcare yourself. I recently met a couple in Edinburgh whose childcare costs were over £800 a month, and you can see why you get to the stage where you think, actually, is this worthwhile? But I recently heard from Brendan Dick, the chief executive of BT, and he was saying that they attract 99% of women back after maternity leave compared to a Scottish average of 47%. And that they'd done that simply by offering flexible working and more opportunity to work at home. And I was sort of contrasting that with your example of Goldman Sachs, where there's this culture of presenteeism. And, you know, Brendan Dick himself said that this is about trust. And it is a real cultural shift, but I just wondered if you thought it would be worthwhile having a bit of focus on that cultural shift as a means to reduce underemployment, certainly amongst women.
Yeah, I mean, again, too, it depends on the nature of your industry and the occupation that you work in. So the extent to which flexibility maybe is to your advantage, but not necessarily to the company's advantage. So, but companies, I think, are increasingly flexible, whether they've gone as far as possible, because there are potential big gains from flexibility. I'm not sure. I don't really have the statistics on that, but you know, your point is perfectly valid. It seems to me that if people are judged now more in some industries, at least, by the output they produce rather than the time spent, then employers should, should be able to figure that out and give employees the best working arrangements that they can that is consistent with that.
David Torrance.
Good morning, Professor Bell. The increase in the number of people working past retirement age, whether it's part-time or full-time, is that restricting access to a workplace for a young and employed?
That's an interesting one, because actually older people have not had a bad recession. They have, in one important sense, and that's when they retire and they try to cash in their pension savings for an annuity, because the rates on annuities are very, very low. And I think part of the reason why people are staying on longer is that they're worried about how much pension their existing savings are going to buy them. Actually, employment among older people, and this is true across Europe, it's not a Scottish thing, it's not a UK thing, has been increasing in the last few years. Even during the recession, for most countries, people aged 50 plus, 55 plus, employment has been increasing. It's not a huge effect on the labour market, but it's bound to have certain knock-on effects. I want to caution against this lump of labour fallacy. There isn't a lump of jobs that if you increase older people working, that by definition reduces the set of opportunities for younger people. But certainly there are interesting changes, and we are seeing people working longer without any shadow of a doubt. I mean, increased health may be playing a part of that. The switch to the service sector may be playing a part of that, because I know, speak to people I know who've been in manual jobs since we were both in school, and they have much greater health problems than I have. But there is a general tendency to older people working longer. I mean, one of the possible advantages is that there's more transfer of experience and skills from that older age group to the young. I'm not really sure what mechanisms we've got in place to ensure that happens.
Briefly.
Can we just define what older people? I mean, I'm getting worried now. 50s
I should be worried.
plus.
Yeah, I mean, so the number of people aged 65 plus still working in Scotland has increased. Yeah.
You mentioned 50, and
yeah,
I was worried.
Normally they split working age to kind of 16 to 24 as youth. 25 to 50 is kind of main working age, and then 50 and over as people that are over the hill like me.
Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, and I will be brief, and good morning, Professor Bell. Could you perhaps comment on how the growth in underemployment in this recession has contributed to poverty compared to underemployment in the previous recession?
Well, I think that's quite difficult. I'm trying to... you see, for example, in the 1980s, you had unemployment in the UK over 3 million, in Scotland over 300,000, I think. And the extent of underemployment was lower then because we had we had a less flexible work environment, partly because of the nature of work being more production oriented and partly because of legislation. And so I don't think there was the same level of underemployment. Certainly looking at the early 1990s, which was also a period of recession, although not so bad in Scotland, I don't think there was the same level of underemployment. And so I suppose this is, for good or bad, probably the most extreme case of underemployment that we've had. And in terms of, its impact on poverty, well, I do believe, but I will check, these are largely people on low wages who would like to work more hours. So an interesting thing might be to compare or to find out how many of them are minimum wage workers, how many of them, how their weekly wage compares with, say, an average weekly benefit levels for comparable people and so on. So I think that it's difficult to compare this recession with previous recessions in terms of underemployment, but there are some things that I could add to what I've already said that might be helpful in answering your question.
You just add them to the list of things that you've written. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think if there are no more members want to come in, I've got one final question I'd just like to ask before you think that you're off the hook, Professor Bell. It's been very interesting from our discussion. We've talked around whether the issue of underemployment is a bad thing in itself, and I don't think we've quite resolved that. But let's assume that we regard underemployment as a bad thing. What can government do about it? What policy changes, if any, should we be looking at to try and reduce the incidence of underemployment?
It's interesting to think if there are tax concessions that might make a difference to employers' willingness to hire people for longer periods of time. I think to earn tax credits, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to work 15 hours a week. See, the downside of increasing that is that there would be more people who fall below that level. Whether there's possibilities of varying national insurance, whether there's possibility of varying other legislation or giving employers incentives to hire people for, let's say, at least 30 hours is the break-off point for part-time working. For having, let's say, a certain proportion of the workforce full-time rather than part-time. But if you do that, you have to really watch the unintended consequences of going down that line, and whether you could have, there's lots of intervention going on in terms of the young unemployed at the moment, interaction with the Skills Scotland and so on. It's difficult to think of a policy other than to make employees so valuable to employers that they wouldn't want to employ them for a short period of time. It's difficult to think of what the agencies in Scotland currently could do to try to up the hours. And of course, the other thing, of course, is to try to increase demand.
Very brief, something from Mark O'Cadgy.
Specifically on that, in one of the papers you wrote with Professor Blanchflower, you cited there were 2.3 million people in the UK at the older end who wanted to work fewer hours. Yes. Is there any scope for a policy opportunity there from government?
That is an interesting question. I mean, and it touches on my feeling that maybe the experience of the older people is not being transferred. We don't have mechanisms very well to transfer the experience of older people. So finding ways out of employment for older people, I don't want to make myself redundant here, but you can get, a lot of that may have to do with pension arrangements. So people get half their pension at a certain point in time, and this is a very fraught area. Because there are lots of regulations that Treasury don't want people to be seen to be taking advantage of pension regulations. But that is an interesting thought, the idea that you could do something around older people.
Right, well, I think we've had a very good kick of the ball this morning, and I'm very grateful to Professor Bell for coming along and answering our questions so comprehensively. I think this is a very interesting area of study, and it may be the committee will come back to you in the next few weeks, but I think you've got a whole list of things to come back to us on, and we'll look forward to receiving that. So on behalf of committee members, thank you very much. Now, if members can just stay in their seats just for a few seconds. Item 2 on the agenda. Can I ask members if they are content to delegate authority to the convener in accordance with Standing Orders 12.4.3 for the payment of any witness expenses that may arise during the duration of the inquiry? Members content with that? Thank you very much. Right, with that we move into private session, and I think we should have a very short suspension.